I am very excited to introduce today's guest for Empowering Caregivers, Patricia Quigley. She is a licensed funeral director and supervisor at Laurel Hill Funeral Home in Philadelphia. She became a licensed funeral director in early 2013 and supervisor of Laurel Hill Funeral Home in 2020. She lives in the East Mount Airy section of Philadelphia with her wife of 33 years and has 2 adult children. She is a former treasurer of Congregation Mishkan Shalom, a member of the Reconstructionist Chevra Kadisha, Jewish Burial Society, District 7 governor of the PFDA, Pennsylvania Funeral Directors Association, and vice president of the Bucks Montgomery PFDA local chapter. Her passion is educating the public about non-traditional options for burial and cremation and the benefits of pre-planning a funeral for yourself or for a loved one. So without further ado, Patricia, please take it away. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. As caregivers, which I'm going to assume most of you are, I can't stress enough how important it is to have a plan in place. The biggest benefit is that you, as the caregiver, won't be in a position when your person dies to have to make a myriad of decisions and not know what their wishes were, not know possibly how to pay for that. And it's just a very trying time because you're also in mourning when that person dies. I just got a call this morning from the ex-husband of someone who died, and legally the next of kin is his son. It was his mom who died, and the son was saying to me, I don't know why we never had this discussion. Like when somebody goes into a nursing home, don't they have this conversation? I have no idea. Like the father wants to bury the ex-husband who wound up being this woman's caretaker, wants to bury her, and the son thinks she wouldn't want to be buried. She would want to be cremated. So you can see how all of this indecision at a time when someone is maybe in shock that their person died. I don't think the woman was even in hospice. She had some medical issues, but nonetheless, the way the son explained to me, this is kind of a shock. And then have to make all these decisions is really, really hard on the survivors. So I can't express enough how important it is to have a plan in place ahead of time. So that's number one, just for the emotional and well-being of all the survivors. Secondly, I don't know if you know this, but it's you can prepay for your funeral arrangements in advance, and in the state of Pennsylvania anyway, it's not legal for funeral homes to accept your money directly in advance, and that's as a protection to the consumer so that the funeral home or the funeral director doesn't mix operating income with pre-need funds. I'm sure you've, well, not sure, but there are some articles that have been written by unscrupulous funeral directors who did that. And so this protects you, the consumer. But the benefit of prepaying in advance is that you lock in today's prices and they're guaranteed when the person dies. So an average funeral 20 years ago was maybe $5,000 or $6,000, and now it's $12,000 or $15,000 for a traditional funeral. So those folks, the only thing that they're responsible for when their person dies is any third-party charges, things that the funeral home has to pay to other entities, like for death certificates. I see a lot of pre-needs that are 20 years old, and death certificates used to be $2 a piece in Pennsylvania. Now they're $20 a piece. Also, depending on how old a person is and what their assets are, because a lot of people's assets do shrink as people get older, not only in amount, but also like they might not have 3 bank accounts now, they just have 1. So you need far less death certificates. So that kind of money can be distributed however, if they pre-needed it, however it makes sense. So if they pre-needed for 10 death certificates at $20 at $2 a piece 20 years ago, and now they're $20 a piece, they might only need 1. Or else the family would have to pay for the extras. Does that make sense? Thank you for a few nods here and there. I appreciate that. There's also certain laws that I always like to go over, and funeral directors should be going over with anyone who is pre-needing. There's something called the funeral rule, and there's 9 items that a funeral director is required to go over with a client before they pay for a funeral, either in a pre-need situation or an at-need situation. And those 9 items, the first 3 are just about giving you, the consumer, our price lists and their effective dates. General price list, casket price list, outer burial container price list, or the vault price list. If someone is just having a direct cremation and they're going to take home their cremated remains, I might only give them the first price list because that's all they need, right? But I would explain why I'm not giving the other 2. Number 4 says that embalming is only required in certain circumstances. That circumstance being a public viewing. So if you're not having a public viewing, that doesn't mean that your immediate family can't see you, but if you're having a public viewing that's advertised in the paper, then you need an embalming. Now, there's some cultures where the Sikh religion, for instance, we do a lot of, we handle a lot of Sikh calls, and it's in their tradition to have a somewhat public viewing. They come in the day before or the morning of and dress their person. They are unembalmed, but it is just their community, so I don't consider that public necessarily. And it's also in their tradition, so we do not embalm Sikh decedents. Number 4 and 5 have to do with cremation. I'm sorry, 5 and 6. 5 just says that embalming is not required for cremation, and 6 says that a casket is not required for cremation, but the body needs to be in something so the crematory operator can manage the body and put the body into the retort. All that's required is a rigid cardboard container for the body. And that was to keep funeral directors from selling caskets to people when they didn't need them. 7 says that the outer burial container or the vault, either for burial of a body or cremated remains, is not required by Pennsylvania law, but it is required in a lot of cemeteries. I would say 90–95% of the cemeteries in Pennsylvania require it. And it's basically just because the cemetery wants to keep their ground level. So you may have been to many or some Jewish cemeteries where the tradition is to have the casket touch the earth. And that's a tradition, you know, kind of ashes to ashes. So the body goes back to the earth, and no outer burial container or vault was required in the past. But even some of those cemeteries have started to require it, because if you see, like, the headstones are going this way and that way, and there may be big divots in the cemetery, it's because decomposition has happened and there is no vault to keep the ground level. So, but it's not required by law. Number 8 is warranties about embalming and merchandise. And number 9 just says that any third-party charges that a funeral home pays on your behalf, there is supposed to be no upcharge. So that's the funeral rule. Another big law to talk about is the order of next of kin, especially with cremation. So with cremation, the next of kin has to sign a cremation authorization, no matter what crematory you're going to. And for a spouse, it would just be one person. If you are talking about cremating the second spouse, right, it would fall to, in general, their adult children. And it's a law that a majority of the next of kin have to agree to cremation. So you can see how problems sometimes arise with, let's say there's 5 children, so we would need 3 of the 5 to sign the cremation authorization. And I've run into problems before, either because we can't find one of the children, or one of the children has objection to cremation. That kind of thing. So it's another good reason to pre-plan in advance. And I always ask families if it is the children who are going to sign, and then it goes down from there, right? So if it's not the children, then it would be siblings and aunts, uncles, all that kind of stuff. If there's anybody who would object to it when they're pre-planning. And if they are, then we have a special form. It's called an agent for disposition form. And that automatically assigns the right of disposition to one person with an alternate. I had recently, this is a couple years ago now, a Jewish couple who wanted cremation, and they had one daughter who was really Orthodox and one daughter who was not. And they knew that the second daughter, or the second spouse when they died, would not approve of the cremation. So they did an agent for disposition for both of them, because we don't know who's going to die first, right? And their other daughter, who approved of their choices, could make the decision and sign all the forms without the other daughter having to sign as well. And I think they used their attorney, maybe their executor, or a friend for the alternate, just in case the daughter who approved of their choices was not available. So that's a really handy form. Most people do not talk about their disposition in their will, and we actually encourage you not to put it in the will, because the will is something that's usually read well after funeral arrangements have been made. So that agent for disposition form, which just needs to be signed and notarized, but just needs to be signed by the person who is making the arrangements for themselves. It doesn't have to be signed by your agent or the alternate agent. It just needs to be signed by you, is something that should be kept separately, and hopefully in a funeral director's file with the plans for whatever funeral arrangements you'd like to make. I hope that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I think we have a few questions that I can feed you from the chat about things we've covered so far. Is that all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So a little confusion. Where do you make the prepay if you can't pay the funeral home directly?
It's a great question. So some firms use trusts. We use insurance. So it's actually called funeral insurance. And the insurance policy would be for the amount of the services that, whatever they are today. So if they're doing a cremation and it's $5,000, it would be for $5,000. If they're doing a full body burial and it's $12,000, it would be for $12,000. So like with any insurance, it is more expensive if you make payments over time. It would just be for the amount of the funeral expenses if you're making a one time payment. And there's a beneficiary. And the reason there's a beneficiary is because if there's money left over, which there usually isn't, right? We hope the funeral insurance policy grows with, at least in part, with inflation. So as funeral costs go up, you know, we hope there's a little bit of money in there. But COVID is a great example when people had planned a full-on funeral and we were not able to deliver that, right? We did not have embalmings, especially at the beginning, because we were all scared to be embalming people who had COVID. We didn't have limo service. We didn't have chapel services. We went straight to graveside with like 10 people or just the immediate family. And so if people had pre-needed all those things, we only could claim with the insurance company the things that we had provided. The beneficiary came into play because the beneficiary received whatever costs we could not provide went to them. Sometimes people just put their estate as the beneficiary. Usually couples put each other. The other thing about the funeral insurance policy is regular life insurance is considered by Medicaid to be an asset. So if someone winds up going into a funeral home, listen to me, a nursing home, and they're on the cusp of going on Medicaid and they have a life insurance policy, Medicaid will make them sell, or, and I'm not sure what the right word is, maybe dissolve that life insurance policy because it's seen as an asset. Medicaid will not make you dissolve. They want you to do this. So we do pre-needs that are called Medicaid spend downs, right? So where people come in right before they're going on Medicaid, they make their funeral arrangements and they take out this funeral insurance policy. They want you to do that. And no one can access that policy without a copy of your death certificate. Funeral insurance policies are also portable. So I've had occasions where families, snowbirds in Florida, have gone to Florida and made their funeral arrangements, and then the parents have gotten sick and the son or daughter live up here and they've moved their parents back up north. And I have accessed funeral insurance policies that have been written in Florida because this is where their funeral is going to take place. Now, if it's a different funeral home, there's no guarantee on the pricing, but at least you can help the family by putting that, whatever is in that insurance policy, towards whatever it costs now.
So actually kind of a related question to the point you just made. Are these laws that you've been talking about, are they federal or are they state by state?
That's a good question. You mean about the funeral insurance policy?
Maybe the person who asked that question could clarify to me in the chat. Looks like she's typing.
The first set of laws, the funeral rule, that's federal.
Okay. Oh, here we go. Both the insurance and the laws governing cremation, burial, etc.
They are federal laws, but we also have to quote, you know, what Pennsylvania, like the whole idea about the vault. I don't know about other states, they might require. It is the funeral rule is governed by the Federal Trade Commission. As far as funeral insurance, I believe that is also a national thing. I could be wrong, but I believe it is. And I do know that it's county by county where Medicaid will give you an amount that you can pre-plan up to. So it might differ by county.
Okay, this person is also saying they're in New Jersey, so not quite Pennsylvania.
New Jersey and Pennsylvania are usually have a lot of similar things. So.
Okay, great. All right, I think we're ready to keep going.
Another question?
No, I think keep going with the presentation.
So those are like the two main reasons. One is to not have the survivors be, you know, caught up with having to make all these decisions. And in fact, I feel like people make more expensive arrangements if they don't know what their loved one wanted. You know, err on the side of like, let's get that, you know, big expensive casket. And some of that could be based on other emotions of like guilt or whatever. So to not have to make them in a highly emotional state is one reason. And the second reason is to prepay and save some money in the end. The third reason is just to have your person have what they want, right? I mean, I think everybody really should say, I want to be cremated or I want to be buried. A lot of people have thoughts like this. I know I have a file about this thick on my mom because every time she goes to a funeral for a friend, she's like, she brings me their little program or their little, you know, thank you card, says, I want this, you know. So people really, it's a loving thing that you would do pre-planning for your family and vice versa for the family to do for you, so that your last wish would be what you wanted. Trying to think of what else. Other things that people don't know about are, and this is not so much pre-planning, but just interesting things in the funeral industry lately, which is that I don't know how many of you know about green burial, but that's become very popular. So green burial is just no embalming, being buried in biodegradable clothing, no buttons, zippers, things that will just, you know, dissipate into the earth. Being in a biodegradable casket, so no metal again in the casket. No finish, varnish on the casket, or an actual shroud. No outer burial container. And that's basically a green burial. The other thing that folks have been, and this is in the Pennsylvania legislature right now, is for cremation. A lot of people don't know that to be cremated, with the amount of gas and fossil fuels that are used for cremation, it's like driving a car 500 miles. So the carbon footprint for cremation is actually, for people who are ecologically conscientious, cremation is not very ecologically conscientious. But in the Pennsylvania legislature, we have a bill for what is called aquamation. Technically, it's called alkaline hydrolysis, which is a method of cremation by water and alkaline as opposed to fire. And this process takes, believe it or not, about 10 times longer than cremation takes, cremation by fire, which is about 2.5 hours, but it uses about 1/10 of the energy. And you get the same result, which is bone and bone fragments. although the ones that are aquamated versus cremated by fire are like pearly white. With the fire, they tend to be more gray. And then they're processed into what you all know as ash. The aquaphor, the leftover liquid from aquamation, is actually a great fertilizer. And we have aquamation here at our cemetery for pets. And we use that aquaphor for watering some of our public flower and bushing areas, like in our front gates and things like that. So that's up and coming. The other thing you may have heard about is natural organic reduction or human composting. And this has gotten some popularity as well. It requires, though, a facility in which to do natural organic reduction. It's recently been approved in Delaware and in New York in the last year or so, but there is no facility. So you still have to go out to the West Coast, because there are facilities out there for what they call human composting. And basically the facilities have cylinders in which the body goes in with all sorts of organic material like wood chips and things like that. And it's kept in this cylinder for about 2 months at a regulated temperature. And also it's rotated regularly. And the end result is also similar in what you get from cremation, in that it does not disintegrate the bones, right? But there is this mulch that's left over, and they do the similar thing that we do with cremation, which is they take out the bones, they put them in a machine to create ash, and then they put everything together. And if the family wants it, they can have yards and yards of great mulch. So that's another thing that's coming up on the horizon. I doubt if it will. There was a bill that incorporated both aquamation and human composting, and that bill has been separated because people in Pennsylvania are a little behind the times, so not open to that. The other interesting thing, and this is in New Jersey actually, I've recently had 2 clients who, have any of you ever heard of MAID? So that's for caregivers, it's an important thing to know. It's medical assistance in dying. And in New Jersey, it is legal. So if someone has a a disease that's not going to get better, a person can choose when and where they would like to die. And I recently had a younger person, well, my age, late 60s, who decided she had brain cancer, and she did her chemo several years ago, and she was basically cancer free, and then all of a sudden it came back with a vengeance, and this was the one thing she felt like she could control. Kids had a harder time with it than her spouse did, but I worked with them in the weeks leading up to her death. She had pre-planned her funeral arrangements, which was great. So it was more about emotional support and knowing when the time was and when they wanted to plan the service, even in advance of her death. And it was actually, her service was very joyful. So they had the time to really get okay with her choice.
Wow. We have a few related questions, if you don't mind taking a little question break. So this is a question about insurance policies, are there ones you often work with or that you would recommend or that are easier to work with?
So, I mean, are you talking about regular life insurance?
Um, I'll ask this person to clarify for me and maybe we'll come back to that.
Most funeral homes will accept regular life insurance policies as a way to pay for the funeral. I know we do, but we also charge a fee to do all that paperwork for you. You have to have an assignment form. You have to make sure the policies is in force.
Mhm.
You have to know who the beneficiaries are.
Mm.
And then usually an insurance company will have like a claim form that the beneficiaries have to sign. We have our funeral insurance assignment form that you have to sign and get notarized. And we usually have to wait a little bit for our money. So people do use life insurance policies to pay for their funeral. And this is not different than the pre-need life insurance I was talking about before, because that's called funeral insurance. But they do, like we do, typically charge an administrative fee for that.
Okay, she's clarified and said she's talking about funeral insurance.
So we use a company called National Guardian Life.
Great, thank you.
And over the years, we've used different companies. I just had a 20-year-old pre-need that was, I think it's called Family Life or something like that. But they've been bought over by another insurance company, so I just had to get the right claim form for that.
Okay, this is a quick one. Are Laurel Hill and West Laurel Hill connected?
So I'm the supervisor of Laurel Hill Funeral Home, which is located on the grounds of Laurel Hill West, or what used to be West Laurel Hill Cemetery. And on the other side of the river is Laurel Hill East, and we are sister cemeteries. Laurel Hill East was, or what used to be called just Laurel Hill, is in Philadelphia between Kelly Drive and Ridge Avenue. And that was the original cemetery. And then they bought, and that cemetery, I think, is like 80 some odd acres. And then they bought 180 some odd acres over here in Bala Cynwyd in Montgomery County. And that became what is now Laurel Hill West. But our funeral home is located on these grounds over in Bala Cynwyd, and our funeral home serves all cemeteries. So I go to different cemeteries all the time. And I go up to New York. We receive bodies from Florida. Like there's, we are not bound to just serving the customers of Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West.
Interesting.
We are connected.
You are connected. Okay. This is a follow-up question about the green burial you were talking about. How expensive or how much generally does this cost, and is it done throughout the country?
It is done throughout the country for sure. I can just speak where, there's a couple of different things I can tell you. So the ground itself, we have green burial areas in our cemeteries that run anywhere from 4,500 to 14,000. And that's location, 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 right? There's a green burial area where it's actually a Friends, it's called Friends Southwest Burial Grounds, and that's in Upper Darby, and that's a older Quaker cemetery, and they do a lot of green burial there. And the last time I had a burial there was 2 years ago, and the grave was 2,500. An average green burial funeral is between $5,000 and $8,000. So you got your cemetery expenses and you got your funeral expenses.
Gotcha. Patricia, it's possible you might be getting to this later, and if so, feel free to let me know. But we're getting a request to talk about arranging transport for the deceased from a facility like assisted living or memory care to a funeral home, including if it's across state lines?
I get asked this question a lot because people have these questions about, a lot of people say, don't you need to be embalmed to go cross state lines? No, you do not. If someone, I happen to be licensed in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which just means that I can do business there without having to ask another funeral director to do the paperwork for me. Mostly. New York is very proprietary, except for during COVID, they were not. So when I go up to New York for a burial, or we have a death up there, but the people want to use our funeral home and our cemetery, I have to engage a New York funeral director, not only to do the paperwork, but also to get that person out of a facility. If they die at home, it's another story. I can go and do that myself. But if it's in a facility, they will only want a New York funeral director to make that transfer. Same with Delaware. So we have partners in the surrounding states that help us out, because I'm the only one who's licensed in New Jersey, and then my other directors are only licensed in Pennsylvania. And we've had enough experience where we know, if we have a death in Delaware or Maryland, call my guy and ask him if he'll do the paperwork for me. And sometimes if it is in a facility, he will just call that facility and say that he's sending someone from his funeral home, even though we're from our funeral home, because we have a trusted relationship. So the family doesn't wind up having to pay for 2 transfers, right? It's just the one with us going down, saying that we work with him. Embalming is not required across state lines. You can't even believe how many Jewish folks we get up from Florida who a long time ago pre-planned their funerals and their burials up here. And as long as the body is kept cool, usually with just regular old ice packs that you put in a cooler. Nobody uses dry ice anymore. It's not very sustainable or environmentally friendly. And bodies don't disintegrate as fast as you think. They just don't. So the summer, you're a little bit more like you hope you would have a direct flight as opposed to a layover. But there's no rule about embalming needs to be done in order to cross state lines.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're at the bottom of the questions and ready for you to move on.
I really don't have anything else to say.
Oh, okay. Well, we have some questions for you. So I would like to know, and I think our social workers are all really interested in this. Families come to us often and say, do you have any tips for having a conversation about this with someone well in advance if they have some initial maybe resistance or don't really want to talk about it?
You guys probably know better than me, but because I'm sure that this is not the only difficult conversation that you have with folks. But maybe the best thing is, especially if people talk about going to a funeral for a friend or a family member, to really ask them what that felt like. Did it make you think of your own? I mean, if you're social workers, you guys know how to have difficult conversations. And I would just say to try to broach the subject as gently as possible. You may be surprised that people really do want to talk about it more than you think. Or the other good way to get people to talk about it is to talk about your own self. I find that if I'm willing to talk about my own, whatever the issue is, right, that it opens up the door for other people to talk about theirs. So you might start with, I recently had a death in the family, and no one even said, no one had had this conversation before, and this is what my experience was. Or, I just recently pre-planned my funeral. And I was wondering if you had thought about that. So, don't be like the shoemaker's kid, where you're walking around with holes in your shoes. Do it for yourselves. And I think it'll be a lot easier to relate to your clients if you've had the experience yourself.
Related, what advice do you have for folks about creating a meaningful ritual or service for a funeral?
I mean, I always recommend that. I think that, having many opportunities to process one's grief is really important. I always think of this guy. It was one of the first green burials we ever did. And I went to the house to pick up his mom, and they had dressed her in her clothes already. She was all ready to go. And the youngest son, he was so grief stricken. He practically got on the cot with her. Like he just didn't want to let her go. And for this green burial in particular, the family actually helped dig the grave. And of course they helped refill it. And I swear that man, you could see the difference in his demeanor from the time that his mom died into the time they were walking away from that grave. He just felt so much lighter, because he had done all these physical things towards the funeral and burial of his mom. We encourage a lot of folks, if they're willing, to participate in the dressing of their loved one. We encourage folks who, in some faiths, or cultures, it's customary to go up to the crematory, and it's an honor to press the button to have the retort start. And we mention this to regular Judeo-Christian families to see if they've chosen cremation, if they'd like to go up there and do that. And more people are wanting to do that. I mean, I analogize it to if someone was being buried, you would take them to the grave, right? You'd see them through. This is seeing them through. What I realized early on was, especially with a Jewish family, that I hadn't put enough ritual around it, right? And so they found the experience to be distasteful to them. So now I always make sure that there's some kind of ritual. Do you want to invite a few people to be with you? Do you want to be with the body in the chapel before we go into the crematory so that you can say your last goodbyes? I describe what it sounds like to be in there, what they might see in there, in more detail, so that they can really make an informed choice about going into the crematory or not. And then afterwards, do you want to just get together with whoever's there with you? Is there a prayer you'd like to say? So I think ritual is really important. The next generation is going to be tougher because they don't see ritual as important, or, maybe they just don't see the meaning behind it. So we'll see. I always try to encourage people, you don't have to have a full-on service in a funeral home. You don't have to pay for that, but like, what was important to your person? Would scattering her cremated remains on the beach be, even though it's illegal, but would that be something that would be meaningful to your person? And if so, have you thought about what you might do besides just the physical act of scattering? What was your favorite music? You know, like just working with people in that way.
Thank you. Are you allowed to sprinkle cremated ash into a family plot or use cremated ash in a green container in the family plot, but not bury the container?
So most cemeteries don't want you to do that. It is, I don't know if the word is illegal, but most cemeteries wouldn't want you to do that. I mean, it is illegal to just scatter cremated remains in public areas. Like people, it really messes with the ecological system.
Hmm.
Cemeteries, it's more they just want to get the fee for, you know, the interment. So they don't want you to do that on your family plot without going through them. But in public places, especially things like the Wissahickon or other parks, cremated remains are not very environmentally friendly. They have a lot of calcium in them, and you could bury them or scatter them in a garden and nothing will grow there. When we do cremated remains in our green sections of the cemetery, we actually use something that's called I think it's called Make Your Love Grow or something, and it looks like a big old bag of fertilizer that we mix with the cremated remains so that the plants that are planted above will not die.
Thank you. When a person dies at home of natural causes, who is the first person that should be called? Physician, ambulance, police, funeral home?
Question. It's one of the things I cover in pre-needs actually. So if a person dies at home and they are not in hospice, then you must call 911. Someone in authority has to come and pronounce that person dead, and communicate sometimes with the coroner to make sure that nothing is suspect at the scene. So, you know, you may have like a 95-year-old who is not in hospice and is doing really well, and they die in their sleep. Still got to call 911. Police have to come. They'll communicate with the coroner and they'll say, you know, there was no like pill bottles out. Everything seems, you know, okay. And the thing about that is then that the primary doctor for that person needs to sign the death certificate. And sometimes there's a little bit of back and forth with, well, I haven't seen her in 6 months. So sometimes we do need to get the coroner involved. It's not that the coroner will take that body into their care, especially if the police have been there and they say that there's nothing suspect that has happened. But the coroner will then have to request medical records from the primary doctor, and if the primary doctor won't sign, then the coroner will actually sign the death certificate with the cause of death, but that it could take a little bit of time.
Mm.
If somebody's in hospice, then the first call is to the hospice nurse, and then the nurse comes out, makes the pronouncement, and usually the hospice nurse will then call the funeral.
Thank you. I think this is something you mentioned earlier, but this person joined a little later. So if you could review, how long can a body be refrigerated without embalming before an open casket funeral?
That's a good question too. So, I mean, the longer your refrigeration is really a great tool. And I have seen a body, you know, up to 4 weeks. First of all, if you're having an open casket funeral and it's a public viewing, then the person is required to be involved. I just want to be clear about that.
Oh.
Okay. We have a gentleman now who we've held on to him for 6 weeks, and I think we are gonna have him for another week or so because his son was deployed somewhere. I don't know, it's very high level, I guess, because we weren't allowed to know where. And they wanted to wait for him to come back.
Hmm.
So he was embalmed, although we did put him back in refrigeration because even embalming doesn't last forever. And his body was pretty, he'd had a tough death. His body was in pretty bad shape when we got him. We have to write the state if we're keeping a body longer than 10 days. I've never been unapproved to do that. Actually, for military burials, sometimes it takes that long. Certainly for if you're being buried in Arlington Cemetery in DC, sometimes that could take a couple months to get in there. So it all depends.
Thank you. All right, this is kind of a very specific situation, but I'm gonna see if it can be generalized. So this person is saying, can you discuss a little bit what happens if you die in a state where funeral homes are non-union, but the deceased is to be buried in a union burial ground? So this person had an experience with their parents who died in Virginia. They were taken to New Jersey to their plot, but at the gates to the burial ground, were told they could not enter the site and that the family had to arrange for a union company to take their body from the gates of the burial ground to the plot. Is that something you've encountered?
Or it's union or not union, I think, I mean, it would probably be more along the lines of the funeral law in the state,
Mm,
where a licensed funeral director from that state has to take the body into that cemetery.
mm.
I'm licensed in New Jersey, so I've never run into that, but I do know in New York, I cannot take a body there and get into the cemetery in New York unless a licensed funeral director, a New York licensed funeral director is with me.
Thank you. All right, this person says, I may have missed this, but are green burials associated with the lasting plot in stone or marker, or is the burial site allowed to become a reused space?
There is no reusing, as far as I know, in the United States, which is kind of a shame because I know in other parts of the world it is, right? It's kind of common actually to keep reusing a grave, you know, after a period of years. So we're going to run out of space here. But no, there's no reusing of graves, even green ones, that I know of. It depends about headstones and things like that. In our green sections, we have 3 green sections. None of them have headstones associated with them. There are walls, like knee-high walls in front of the sections that have ledger stones on them, and a person's name and year of birth and year of death can be engraved on that, so that there is more of a communal headstone.
Interesting. What are your thoughts on making cremains into diamonds? Is that legitimate?
I mean, they're not diamonds, they're what do you call that stuff? Zirconium or something? I forget. My earrings are that. They're not real.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know they're not real mined diamonds, but I guess in a jewel that looks like a diamond that's made of cremains. Have you had experience with this?
People like all sorts of stuff, you know, for cremated remains. There's all sorts of jewelry options.
Okay, do the rules about hospice managing a death instead of the coroner also apply if the hospice care is being given in a facility like assisted living, for example, as they do when a death happens at home?
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
If the person is enrolled in hospice, then the hospice nurse is the person to call. Now, in a facility where the person isn't in hospice and but they're at an assisted living facility, usually there's a nurse there. I believe that, even if it's not a hospice nurse, so I don't think they need to call 911.
Right, right.
Somebody in authority has to pronounce.
Yeah, usually in our experience, if someone's not under hospice at assisted living or a nursing home, the medical director can come in and pronounce. Yeah. Does Laurel Hill have an area for Catholic burial?
We don't have a specific area for Catholic burial. We are a non-denominational cemeteries, but we do have 2 Jewish sections, and I think they're the only ones that, require their own, they like their own section.
Hmm.
But we have Jews all over the cemetery too. There's not, but that's very popular.
Hmm. Someone is curious if you're not allowed to sprinkle ashes in a family plot due to environmental reasons, why is that allowed in a sprinkling garden?
So in a scattering garden, we call
Scattering
it,
garden. Thank
you
you.
have scattering gardens. The plants themselves, the foliage that's in those gardens is more receptive to the cremated remains, and we clean it so that the plants don't die by using this, special fertilizer and things like that. So it always looks beautiful.
Okay, great. All right, I am actually at the end of our question box here, so I'm going to encourage folks if they have any other questions they're sitting on to please type them in the chat or clarifications of questions, and we'll give it a few minutes, and then we might end a little earlier than we usually do. All right, so let's give it 2-3 minutes to see if anyone else has other questions for the chat. In the meantime, I want to thank you, Patricia, for making the time to join us today. This was really helpful for my team, and it sounds like for others in the group.
Good. Good.
We will. Okay. All right, here's a question. When someone is planning a pre-burial funeral, should they first contact the funeral home or an insurance policy?
Definitely the funeral home.
Funeral home. Got it.
So they go hand in hand, right? But the funeral home will have either a trust or a funeral insurance program for you.
Mm-hmm.
If people come in with their own insurance policy, we can't guarantee our prices because we don't have control over that policy. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. A lot of thank yous in the chat, so echoing the thank you we gave you.
And if anybody comes up with any other questions or you need, feel free to share my email with folks. Or my direct line I can give you. If you have any other questions, this is my passion, is to educate people. And I'm always happy to answer anything.
Okay, great. A lot of good information. Okay, one last question before we let you go. Is the predisposition form available online?
The predisposition. You mean agent for disposition?
Person in the comments, please. Yes?
Not that I know of, but I could send it to you, Allison, and you could distribute it to folks.
Sure. So for everyone who's registered today, what we'll do is when the recording is available, we'll send out the recording, we'll send out Patricia's contact information. And if you're able to email me that form, I can also email that out. That will come not immediately. It usually takes us 2, sometimes 3 weeks to edit the video. But we will get that to you within the next few weeks.
Okay.
So I want to let everyone know that our next Empowering Caregivers section, which is our last one for the semester, if you will, is on May 3rd at noon with Kristen Nelson of Audivy, which is a memory bank. It's a really cool product that you can download as an app on your phone, where you can actually upload photos and then take audio of people talking about memories associated with the photos. That is May 3rd at noon. And you can register on our website at penmemorycenter.org. And again, thank you for coming today.